Hello again, and welcome back to Virtual Stripecon. Can you imagine how Silverstripe would work without Uncle Cheese? I won't. I cannot imagine, and I don't want to imagine that. So here is Uncle Cheese. Hello.
Hello.
Good to see you.
Good to be here.
Looks like everything is working. So you will tell us about Headless. I'm very much looking forward into this because I'm also working with headless systems on Silverstripe. And yeah, have fun.
All right. Welcome, welcome. I'm pumped. Willkommen. Probably the most unwelcoming way to say welcome I can possibly imagine. Bienvenue to mes amis français. This is awesome. This is my third time speaking at Stripecon. The first time was in Wellington. It was a live event. The second time we did it last year as a hybrid sort of, we did a live stream and I was speaking to a live audience. This time it's fully virtual. It's also the first time I've done it in my pajamas. So just keep this webcam tilted up, I guess. There we go. All right. So we're here to talk about headless architecture in Silverstripe. And let's just get straight into it. So this talk is going to be a lot about the research we've done at Silverstripe on headless architecture and how we've kind of demystified it and looked at some of the technical uncertainties and how we've approached that. And then at the end, I'm going to present you with something you can really use and something that'll be quite exciting. So it's a really good mix of topics where like we'll cover some ideological stuff and some data and kind of opinions and things like that. And then we'll get into some really cool like code stuff. And of course, I'm going to do live coding because I'm insane. So let's go. I am Aaron Carlino. I'm the principal product developer on the open source team at Silverstripe. My role is really quite cool. I love it. I'm responsible for looking after some of the high-level R&D initiatives for the product. So, you know, where things are going and what kind of technical things we need to be figuring out and making big bets and kind of doing proofs of concept on things, figuring out what won't work, what will, collecting data. So it's really quite fun and it's kind of serendipitous in a way that I would end up in a place like this here in Wellington doing these kinds of initiatives for the product I've grown to love for 15 years in the community. I've built a lot of modules. Some of them work, most of them don't, but go check them out and try at your own risk. So that's it. No real nicknames or anything to speak of. Just first name, surname is fine. You don't need to worry about calling me anything else. Pretty straightforward. So I'm talking about headless today. And if that sounds familiar, you're probably right to assume that. In 2017, I did a talk called How to Build Headless Apps with Silverstripe. In 2020, I did a talk called How to Build Headless Apps with Silverstripe. And in 2021, I'm talking about how to build headless apps with Silverstripe. So this is how you know, based on this timeline, that we're making really good progress. This is a hard issue. It's hard to do headless. There's a lot of things that we need to unravel. Silverstripe was built 20 years ago as a monolithic product. And we're kind of subverting that. We're trying to do what it doesn't really want to do by its very nature. So we talked last time around about, excuse me, I'm just going to try to get my presenter view working. I don't have my notes up. It doesn't seem to be working. I'll just wing it. So last time we talked about, I kind of made the case for headless, and I spent a lot of time on this, like, you know, why should you be thinking this way? I'm not going to do that again, but I do think it's necessary for context to kind of just go over some of those things. So I'll start with just a couple of slides here. Shoot. There we go. So sometime in the last year, 2 years, 3 years, whatever, you and your team might have been asked to build an app, and you got to use all these cool things that you never used before. You get to use like front-end technology and APIs and things that you don't normally get to use as part and parcel of a Silverstripe project. And you were like, holy shit, this is so much fun. I love this stuff. And you really enjoyed working with these tools. And not many people know this, but that is actually the holy shit emoji. So that was decided, I think, last week. They voted on it or something. And so feel free to use that from now on. But a few weeks later, you went back to your old web projects and you were like, ah, man, back to this. I wish I could use the app stuff for my website stuff. So I have really good news for you today. We're not talking about apps. We're talking about websites. We're talking about building websites with app technology, which is awesome. We're done with this, like, keeping these separate paths and separate areas of concerns with regard to the app space and the website space, right? We are talking about websites. We're talking about server rendered content. We're talking about public facing, right? We're talking about websites that people use, not apps. Go build your apps somewhere else. There's plenty of ways to build apps. We want to build websites in a really cool and fun way. So why headless? Let's go through some of the bullet points here. Last year, I talked a lot about this point, guaranteeing data sovereignty to your clients. This is a big deal. So I gave this example last time. You have a team of developers, your client is, working with you closely, and you need to hire a contractor, or someone leaves the team and you need to bring someone else on board, and you say to the client, as you might have to, hey, we need to get access to the source code repository for this new developer that you've never met. Not too difficult a conversation, maybe some procedures to follow, maybe the IT guy has to have his or her say. Pretty typical for a developer to want to ask something like that. That's what developers do. They work with code. Now imagine the same scenario when you go back and say, well, that same developer, in order to do his or her work, needs a copy of the live database. Can you hand that over, please? Not such a not such an easy question to answer, right? So now some clients might be okay with that. That's cool, do you? But the types of clients we're used to dealing with at Silverstripe, and perhaps you are as well, they kind of see that as you crossing a boundary, right? And you are, like, the data is the client's territory. That is a sovereign space of the project. Code belongs to developers, data belongs to the client, right? It's a pretty clear line that you're crossing. So why does that matter? Well, in an API-driven architecture, you are affording the client that sovereignty, that control over their content. It belongs to them. When they come to you and say, I want to build this project, I really like the look of this Silverstripe. I'm totally down with, I love the content management. I love the versioning. I love the grid field. I'm on board, but sometime later, they might have a decision come down from upstairs. Who knows? Something changes and they need to get out. Maybe they have a falling out with you or someone else. They're doing their due diligence, right? As anyone would. And now they need to move on. And the only way out, the only exit strategy they have is a database dump. That's not going to work. That's really cumbersome and expensive to port over to a new platform. An API, on the other hand, is really easy to port over to a new platform. It's just an API. In fact, they could keep their data there if they needed to and move on to something else. So this is a really wonderful thing you can do to your client to de-risk and allow them flexibility in their decision. It gives you a lot of leverage as the person engaging with them. Now, more secure, these headless sites tend to be more secure. They aren't more secure by default, but just in general, the security profile and attack surface of a headless app is going to be a lot smaller than one of them monolithic. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, First of all, you have a platform that's just dedicated to hosting the front end. And those platforms tend to be really good at hosting front ends. They've got all kinds of mitigation strategies against DDoS, and they've got CDNs, they've got serverless functions and all the things, right? But more importantly, the area that we're used to worrying the most about, the CMS, the stack, right, is actually playing a much more diminished role in the public-facing side of the website. All it's doing is interacting with the headless instance. You can scale it down, you can IP restrict it, you can make it play a much smaller role in the overall architecture of your site. So that's a big deal, right? Like when your CMS is playing an active role in not only the content management, but the delivery of all the pages, you're just exposed much more to security issues. So easy to say that headless is a much more secure architecture. Better performance, let's not get carried away here and say that just because it's headless, it's better performing. There are client-rendered apps that are super slow. There are server-rendered apps that are super fast, right? So it's not, these things are not mutually exclusive. There's a lot of overlap and nuance to it. However, in a headless architecture, you just tend to be afforded more opportunities to optimize your site and think about performance. And generally, a headless app is going to feel faster than a server-rendered one. And that's because a lot of the interactions are done in the browser rather than over the network. So don't get into headless just because it is an answer for your performance problems. That's not a good route to be going down. But as a side effect, it's a really nice one to have, that you will get better performance with a headless architecture. You're probably going to have lower hosting costs because, again, most of the requests are coming to a hosting provider that just does front ends. And they do this really well. Now, headless and tends to get conflated with static, and that's true. There's a lot of overlap between the two, and it's probably fair to do that. And hosting static stuff is really cheap because it's static. So it's just easy to do. Dynamic stuff tends to be in the serverless function space. And so your costs go way down because all you're doing is paying for each cycle, right? So hosting costs tend to be a big part of the headless choice as well. I mean, a lot of these sites, a lot of these platforms will host you for free if your site is reasonably small, right? So that's definitely a big issue to be thinking about. Designers love headless because of component-based design, and it really encourages you to think in terms of what is the role of this UI element, not in terms of what context it's in, but like what is the thing and how is it composed. When you go and build that carousel for your favorite client, and then another one comes down 2 months later and says they need a carousel, and it rings a bell, you can reuse that component because the component doesn't know anything about that site. It just knows it's a carousel and it needs a couple images and a headline and whatever, right? So this really encourages the use of wonderful design kind of by default, and increases in efficiency and saves on costs just by giving you such a starting point that's so farther down the track than if you were to be building that from the ground up. And let's not forget about the rich ecosystem of UI libraries out there where, you know, if you need that drop-down date picker thing for the form on the whatever page, and you're doing it in React, say, there's 50,000 of those to choose from, and they're all UI agnostic. They're probably just going to give you whatever UI you want to use, and they fit in seamlessly into your project. So it really accelerates this whole concept of building great UIs. The last thing I'd say is that headless is really good at affording clients the opportunity to choose best of breed services. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, you might have a client that comes to you and says, we love it. We love Silverstripe. We're into, like I said, love those grid fields. and we're on board. We want to sign on with this thing. However, did I tell you we have a shop? And, you know, they're just not, we really like Shopify and we want to stick with Shopify. We really can't proceed with this. As much as we love it, we cannot migrate the store to Silverstripe. Now, in the back of your mind, you might be thinking, oh, thank God, because I don't want to do your store. Silverstripe doesn't tend to be very good at e-commerce. You're probably going to have to spin up some bespoke thing, right? And so, you know, and if you don't have this headless opportunity, you're kind of thinking, well, what am I going to do here? What is my exit strategy? How do I get them over to Silverstripe? And with a headless architecture, you're just dealing with APIs. Shopify has a great API. Silverstripe has a great API. That's a wonderful thing. You just have two APIs that are both participating in the front end of your website, right? The data source just becomes kind of this implementation detail. Your client is right for wanting to use Shopify over something else. It's a great platform. It's really good at what it does. And there are other services out there that are really good at doing their one specific thing. Let the client choose from the best of breed. There's nothing wrong with that. It can still be a Silverstripe website with the furnishings and accessories of all these wonderful platforms out there. We don't need to write them off just because they're not Silverstripe. So we talked about why. Now, how do we do it? Well, last time I talked a lot about how to do headless begins with Silverstripe GraphQL 4. You need to be using this. Silverstripe GraphQL 3 is not very good. It's quite slow. The headline on that is quite simply, it's the difference between a dynamically rendered website and a statically rendered website. In GraphQL 3, the schema is generated on every single request and you pay a penalty for it. As the schema grows, that penalty increases. So it's not a good fit for API-driven sites. In Silverstripe 4, we have a build task that generates the schema, caches it, and allows that executable code to be run on every single request. The penalty is 0. The bottleneck that you see in a Silverstripe 4 request is simply ORM and controller stack. So it's up to you to optimize all that the way you need to. But generally speaking, in fact, absolutely speaking, Silverstripe 4 GraphQL requests are way faster than the 3 version. There's also other benefits in developer ergonomics. It's a really good API with some, we tend to lean into the YAML layer and kind of encourage the use of that. And there's some really good kind of opinions and assumptions we make about how GraphQL can be used. And generally, you're going to be writing a lot less code. It is supported in the 4.9 release, which means that if you're using Silverstripe GraphQL 4, you're not going to break the admin, which is great. And we will be dropping support for 3.0 probably in 4.10. It's really cumbersome and awkward and expensive to be maintaining these parallel versions and compatibility with 2 APIs. It's just not fun. So just be aware that you'll be coerced into moving into GraphQL 4 in the not so distant future. Once you choose GraphQL 4, you need to now choose what front-end stack you're going to be using to generate your headless website. The 2 that we looked at Silverstripe were Gatsby and Nexjs. And we looked a lot into these. There's a lot of others out there that you can look at as well. There's so many stacks that do this. What we liked about Gatsby and Next is that they were clearly at the top of the pack. They were getting the most attention, and they offer these cloud platforms to back them up. So you can host your Gatsby site with the people who make Gatsby. You can host your Nextjs site with the people who make Next. That's a really cool thing. We do that at Silverstripe. We let you host your Silverstripe site with the people who make Silverstripe. That's a value proposition that we're really proud of and we lean into, right? So those are all really good things. And that's why we looked at these too. I keep saying we. I was on a team with Ingo at the time, and we looked at these things, but to be honest, it was mostly me. So it sounds weird every time I say we. I think I'm just kind of, I'm just used to saying that. It's a little known fact, Ingo is terrified of headless. It really scared him off, and that's why he left. So we miss you, Ingo, but really sorry. But maybe this will bring you around. Back to Gatsby and Next. So what's the difference? We talked a lot about Gatsby last time. And I kind of made the whole case for, why you want to use that. So value proposition between the two of them are quite similar. Gatsby is a framework that helps you build websites with React. And value proposition of Next is that it's a framework that helps you build websites with React. So a lot of overlap there. The approach differs, and they're actually inverted. So the approach of Gatsby is that it's static by default and dynamic by opt-in. Next is dynamic by default and static by opt-in. Next has gotten a lot better over the years of encouraging you to do static. There's more and more APIs for doing static. And in fact, their documentation, it encourages you to do static, and they're pushing the server-rendered stuff farther down to the bottom of the page. But at the end of the day, Next is run on a dynamic server. It's not static, so it'll always be dynamic by default. With headless apps, this build time stuff is mental. You're just going to be worried about build times, and that's just a huge part of it's the main thing you need to navigate in a headless app, is dealing with build times. So how does each one deal with that? Well, in Gatsby, the build time mitigation is done with these things, what they call incremental builds. And they've gotten really good at this, which is, and an incremental build is when you are able to fetch a portion of the data that has changed. They call this delta fetching. So you can say, well, I last built my site on the 18th of September, and I want just the data that's changed since then. And then it'll augment the site just using that diff, right? And you still get a full build of the entire site, but the work it has to do is minimized by the size of that fetch. Now, if that fetch has a page that changed the title in the main navigation, for instance, you're building the entire thing. So incremental static build, it's a really nice concept, and like I said, it's something they've done very well, but it's not a magic bullet. The build time mitigation for Next is what they call partial static builds, or incremental static generation, which allows you to define just the portion of your site you want to be static. And the long tail that goes off into the future indefinitely is generated on the server and cached after it's generated. So it's up to you. You can have 1,000 pages in that build. You can have 0 pages in that build. You can have a 0 build time if you want to. You can do the whole thing dynamic. So they leave it up to you, which is quite cool. In terms of design, we find that Gatsby is very highly opinionated. It literally has its own GraphQL API that you need to work with, and all kinds of methods with special names and different argument signatures. You're constantly checking the documentation to see what each thing does, and it can be quite confusing. And it does have quite a steep learning curve. Once you beat that curve, you're pretty sweet, but it takes a while to get going. The payoff is really slow. In Next, it's much more minimally opinionated. Bring your own data fetching, just a few corners of the API to understand. I really think if you were to spend 30 minutes reading the Nexjs documentation, you'd be ready to build a Nexjs website. It's really quite clear. So the learning curve is much more generous on that one. When we looked at Gatsby, we collected a lot of data, and a couple things came up. So in the good column, it does what it says on the tin, which is great. Not so good, it does what it says on the tin. So look, it's really good at building static websites. You get to use React, you get to use all the tools you want to, and what you get is a blazing fast website that scores 100 across the board on Lighthouse. And as promised, you get to have that, right? However, at the end of the day, it's a static site generator. And invariably, you might find that you kind of get painted into a corner. Can you do dynamic stuff with Gatsby? Absolutely, and they're leaning more into this in their latest version 4 release. But it is clear that this is a very awkward kind of place to be when they're static by default, and so this is always going to be a bit pushing a boulder uphill, so to speak, with Gatsby. If you have a small site that is perfect candidate for static, by all means, it's a great fit, but not for everything. Another thing we found is these build times, right? We talked about build times and that being just a key issue to deal with in Headless. So when we tested, and I'm going to say we did 1,500 pages using Gatsby Cloud and Netlify as our control. 1,500 pages, good size site, not massive, but good size. But like the area we'd really feel like we had battle tested it. Previews came in just around 15 seconds. Not great. I mean, if you're the marketing person who's got to update the typo in the press release and you hit save and then you're waiting and you're waiting and you're waiting. I don't even think this has been 15 seconds. It's been 15 seconds. It's too long. It's too long. You can't wait 15 seconds. So even Gatsby themselves say, if you want to be on our cloud platform and you want to be a supported CMS, you got to be under 5 seconds. And if you watch some of these more modern CMSs, the way they do preview with Gatsby, it's instantaneous. It looks like Google Docs, like you're editing in the CMS and it just appears. So, and to our credit, we followed really all the best practices we could in building that preview feature, and it's just slow. There's just a lot of things to do. With incremental builds, decent, right? A minute and a quarter is in the ballpark of what you'd expect out of HTTP caching. For instance, if your content author is used to, hitting publish and then waiting for the cache to expire, like that's reasonable. A minute, like you might be able to explain that away. Not stellar though. And then the full build at 8 minutes. Hopefully, you're not doing that a whole lot, but none of these numbers are like, oh, I got to use it, right? Like it's all kind of like, it's not a whole lot to get excited about. And again, I really want to pat myself on the back for like really trying to get it to work well. I feel like we put a lot of resources into getting these numbers down, and it wasn't that great. So the next thing we ran into is uploaded assets. Now, static site generators want to treat all your static content as kind of the same thing. It's all part of the static build, right? So uploaded assets are very much a part of that. When you do your static build, it's going to want to go and pull down all the files. And pulling down all the files is a lot of work. So we figured out that if we wanted to target 70% of our clients, we'd have to demonstrate the ability to move 8 gig of assets. That's a lot. And now you can kind of have some leeway with that number because not all those assets are actually used in the site. A lot of people have, they've got 15 different versions of a PDF and only one of them is on the website, etc. But it was definitely the canary in the coal mine that was saying like, you might have a problem here, because it's okay to say on go live day, we got to move 8 gig of assets into the static build, but you just know at some point, someone's going to get frustrated and they're going to hit that clear cache button and do the full build. And it's going to be 4, 5, 6 hours till they see their build. This was a problem. This was a big problem. And it wasn't one that we were able to navigate that easily. The last thing I'll say about Gatsby that was a bit of a blocker was just this whole thing of the source plugin. It's a very... it seems like a very unnecessary, cumbersome layer of abstraction that you're just jamming things into their GraphQL API. And because of that, the source plugin is everything. If you are using a CMS with a really good source plugin, you're going to have a great time because it builds out the GraphQL API in Gatsby the way you'd expect, and everything is just right there where you want it. If the source plugin sucks, you're going to have a bad time. And the fact is, it's just hard to build a source plugin for Silverstripe, because we found that we had this great GraphQL 4 API that we had spent, months and months, almost a year working on. And we were essentially rebuilding it in Gatsby land. Custom resolvers and relate this to that. And, oh, what about inheritance? And we have this bizarre thing with, inheritance and interfaces and things like that. And that just was not obvious. Like, Gatsby just wants to introspect your GraphQL API and kind of make a bunch of assumptions and build it out, right? So for things like document-based CMSs, contentful, sanity, that kind of stuff, like, it's great because there's only like 3 or 4 different types of data. In Silverstripe, you've got 50 data objects, you've got 50 different distinct types of data that all have their own concerns. And so I didn't really like that approach. It felt like a lot of work. Now, if we got the source plugin right, it would be a great experience, but it just always felt like it was going to fall apart at some point. So, and I just didn't really like that we weren't able to leverage all that work we did on GraphQL 4. So in terms of outcomes, well, we got some great stuff out of it. We definitely have a better understanding of build times, as I showed you. There's lots of data on that. I showed you just a bit of it, but there's heaps more. We did small sites, mega sites, all kinds of sites on different platforms. We were able to prove that you could do preview on something like Heroku, so you wouldn't have to be married to the Gatsby Cloud platform. That was quite cool. And then we got some open source contributions out of it. So there is the Silverstripe Gatsby module now. There's the Gatsby source Silverstripe plugin for getting Silverstripe content into your Gatsby project. And then they recommend you have a starter for every CMS, like there's the Gatsby WordPress starter and all that stuff. So we built a starter. So anyone is welcome to jump in there and carry the torch on those. They are really wonderful and they're totally ready to go. Just ignore that. On to Nexjs. What did we find about Nexjs? Well, love the developer experience. The Nexjs prides themselves on being the PHP of JavaScript, right? So it's just drop the file in the file system and it gets its own route. Awesome. So the way that you do blog.php, and then you go to /blog, and then in that PHP file, you do all your data fetching and you create your view, and then you ultimately just return an HTML response to the browser. That's how Next works. And so it just abstracts away all this, isomorphic rendering and all these things you just don't ever want to have to think about. It just kind of works. So that's great. I mean, the developer experience is awesome. It gives us, unlike Gatsby, an opportunity to really show off GraphQL 4. You can use the API the way it's supposed to be used. You can consume all that great content, and it's not standing in your way with its own idiosyncratic way of doing things. We also like that because it's dynamic by default, previews are just built in. So it's a dynamic server. It can authenticate you. It can set cookies. It can do all kinds of things that will allow you to securely view previewed content. So that's really, really nice. With Gatsby, yeah, it supports previews, but you really have to know what you're doing. You got to know the secret sauce, and you got to really optimize for it. So, and you probably have to use their platform. I hate to say it, like I didn't have a great time using non-Gatsby architecture with preview. We also like that you can do this design your own build time. That's a really cool offering for a client. Just decide what you want in the static build. Is it, huge? Is it small? Whatever. How long are you willing to wait for a build? That's a really cool thing. Not so good. We have to call out the hosting requirements here. A lot of you might be used to hosting on Node. We're not. That's kind of a new thing. So Node hosting, it really presents something to figure out for a lot of agencies, particularly ones that have their own digital platforms, right? So, and it's not even just as easy as having node hosting. Like Netlify only started hosting Nexjs projects in the last 6 months, I want to say. So there's a bit of like, you got to kind of have the right setup for it. With Gatsby, of course, you're dealing with static builds, and so that can just go anywhere. You can check that on literally anything. Literally anything. It's static. There's also this idea of non-atomic deployments, which I'd want to call out. With a Gatsby build, you get a static set of assets, and it all goes up, and it stays that way until you overwrite it. With Next, you're defining like, well, this part of it's static, but the rest of it is going to morph over time and mutate as people access the site, and it's not going to be the same deployment it was when you pushed it up. I can't think of any specific reason off the top of my head why that would be a problem, but it just seems awkward, and at some point it seems like an infrastructure challenge to have non-atomic deployments like that. We're also probably going to be dealing with CMS hosted assets, which is in violation of the whole headless paradigm. You would be exposing the CMS URL into your build. Probably not a huge deal since it's just static stuff, but of course, if you were able to host your assets on S3 or something, which you should be doing in a headless architecture, I don't know if too many people are doing that in Silverstripe, but it is a good reason to look into hosting your assets on something like S3, now that we have the asset abstraction in Silverstripe 4. What kind of technical challenges did we run into in building a Nexjs Silverstripe integration? Well, Nexjs is very appy out of the box. So like I said, it gives you this kind of file system routing, and it kind of assumes that you're going to build these routes in the file system. And you are afforded this kind of off-ramp for dynamic routes. So you can say blog/ID and deal with that. But for the most part, if you look at the directory structure of your pages, it should be kind of clear what the routes are. The file system has a lot to say about what the routes are. In a system like Silverstripe, we don't do it that way. We delegate all of the route authority to the CMS. The CMS knows what the routes are. Don't question it. We might jam some things in a director and everything and kind of create our own custom rules, but by and large, most routes are generated by the CMS. So how do you create a system where you can just say, I don't have any routes. I'm just going to let you tell me what the routes are and I'll deal with it. There is an option for that in Next. They have a catch-all route. But when you get into this idea of treating it like an index.php in Silverstripe, which is to say, the route comes in, we find out what data type that route is, we find the controller for that route, we do the data fetching for that route, and then we create a view for that route and an HTML response, right? All those things coming from just one piece of information in the request going through index.php, this one entry point out to the browser. How can you do that in this kind of system? Well, that gets really challenging. So things like automatic template selection and query selection, how are you going to do that? Persisting state across the builds turned out to be really challenging because they light up multiple workers. That's a great thing because it speeds up the build, but you can't rely on memory to persist state. You have to use the file system. Customizing the static build. We wanted a really good user experience for that. How do you define what's in the static build and what isn't? And lastly, this issue of content blocks in GraphQL keeps coming up. If you've used GraphQL quite a bit, you might know that one of the areas where it struggles, and actually it's not where GraphQL struggles, it's got to do with our inheritance pattern. Content blocks are almost always subclasses. So they're always these abstractions, and you're never really querying a concretion. You're querying this abstraction polymorphic thing where you just say, give me all the elements. And an element could be anything. It's not going to be base element. It's going to be something else, right? And because content blocks are by definition context-free, every single page has to query every single block. So it's just like kind of, and you see these queries that might look like this, right? So you get the elements, and then you got to go through and you say, okay, well, I want these fields on all the elements. I want ID and title and all that. But then I got to do all these inline fragments for every single concretion. And that just gets really verbose. So how are we going to solve that? That seems tedious. Well, we did solve a lot of these things, and I am very happy to present to you the Nexjs Silverstripe starter kit, which is now up on GitHub as of today. So what's inside? A lot of stuff. It's got a lot of stuff. And we're going to, I hate to tell you, I'm going to talk about each one of these things. So, pull out your phone or something and start scrolling through the Twitter feed, because this is going to be a lot of fun. So let's get straight into it. So inside Nexjs Silverstripe. What do you get? Automatic template query selection. So just like what I talked about before, the route comes in, right? It goes into something, and then it's got to select what the right way to render that is and what its data is. So about us is going to come in and say, oh, that's a page. I know what that is. I'm going to get the page component. And I also see that I have page.graphql. So that means I've got some data too. And I'm going to pipe that into the component as a prop, and then I'm going to generate an HTML response. Similarly, we have the staff page comes in, resolves to staff page.graphql gets executed, HTML response, right? We have the same fallback pattern as we expect in SS Viewer. So what happens when products comes in and it strikes out on product page? Doesn't exist. It's going to fall back to page. Follows the inheritance pattern, right? In this case, product page.graphql does exist, so that result would get executed and piped into page. Not sure why that would ever happen, but you know, it's certainly in theory it could. As another example, contact us might just be a page type that has no specific needs. Maybe you don't have a template for it, and you don't have a GraphQL file for it. It just resolves to page and page.graphql. We have a bulk query adapter. If you've used Nexjs, you might be familiar with this problem you run into where every single page is running kind of similarly concerned queries all the time. So in this case, we'd be running read one page, link about us, link products, link contact us, right? This gets slow. It's, in my experience, I've seen it actually knock over a server because it's just so much rapid, so many requests coming in such a short period of time. So what happens if you're using Silverstripe GraphQL 4 API, it's going to recognize those types of queries, defer them, say, okay, yep, I got it. You want about us, noted, and then rewrite that query to the plural form so that links just becomes one single argument and you get one query. That query then takes its result and warms the cache for every single one of those queries you see on the left. So when they get executed, they hit the file system cache, not the network. Massive performance improvement. We get static queries. One of the best things about Gatsby is this use static query hook. If you don't know, static queries are this concept of queries that don't require any page context. A great example is main menu. Another great example is site config. If you want to get something off a site config, it's never going to need any other variables coming in from the page context. It's always the same. There's only one. So if we look at main menu here, the query is always the same. It's get parent ID 0, show in menus equals true. Okay? So if you don't have static queries, every single time you build a page, you're going to run that query. It's totally unnecessary because you already know the result. Now, you might get creative on the back end and say, well, I'll write some sort of caching thing that it won't hit the database, right? But you're still going over the network, and it's just not a great solution. To be honest, it's a bit of a hack. Use static query before the build is run, all these hooks get parsed out, the queries get executed, the results get stuffed into the cache, then the build runs, and anything that's using use static query hits the cache. It does not hit the network. So that's a really awesome feature. And thanks to Gatsby for the inspiration on that one. We provide some navigation helpers. So this navigation element is a headless UI element, and it just provides you with the state for navigation and the navigation item. You provided a list of items that adhere to the page interface and the router, and it's able to just generate that navigation for you. So in this case, you see I'm checking some state. I'm getting is current. There's a whole slew of those that you can check. You got in section, etc. You can do more complex things with navigation utilities. So in this case, we're checking is level 2. And if we're on level 2, we want to show some subnav, right? And in that subnav, we don't want to get the children of the page. We want to get the peers of the page, right? So navigation utilities ship with the starter kit, and can be very useful. You get a lot of the same things you expect out of a Silverstripe content controller. And the full list of all the utilities is right there. That's just all the stuff you get. So things you would, like I said, you would expect to get out of the menu controls you're used to using. Embedded HTML. This might seem like, why would you need to do that? Can't I just take page.content and stuff it into dangerously set inner HTML? Well, you can, with the major caveat that it is dangerous. So for obvious reasons, you shouldn't be using dangerously set HTML, but there's more reasons to avoid that. By using that type of approach, you are just putting all the HTML in as a string, and it doesn't become a first-class set of React components. The issue with that is that when we render it as proper React components, we can actually we can interact with each one of those elements and mutate them the way that we might need to. So a great example of this is that links coming in from the HTML string should not just be standard anchor tags, because that's going to refresh the browser. You want them to be next links, right? So it's a client-side link. So internal links will get rewritten as proper next links by using this HTML element helper. We also rewrite image URLs as absolute. And in the near future, we'll rewrite those images to use the proper next image component, which is kind of new and looks awesome. So a lot of cool stuff you can do there, and highly recommend you use the embedded HTML helper. We do dynamic imports by default through generated code. Why? Well, when you go to homepage, you don't want to get blog page and staff page and all the other stuff that's in there. You don't want that in your build. You want a dynamic import for just homepage, so that the size of the JavaScript payload is not affected by all the other stuff you're not using, dead code, right? And we achieve that through dynamic imports. Why does it have to be generated code? That's a complicated answer. I'm not going to explain why, but like it just has to do with how you need to be able to import a proper Webpack module in your client-side code, and so you just need to have you need to define a module basically for that to import. But that's all handled for you. You never even have to look at that. This also works for content blocks. So if you've got an elemental area and it only has the carousel block on it, it's not going to download the tab accordion block. It's not going to download the latest blog post block. It's not going to download the content block. It just gives you the block that you're using, keeping the JavaScript payload small. We bind the entire app to your GraphQL schema. So when you're working with a component that has a query result, you get this wonderful developer experience of just typing and just seeing what the fields are. And you know where all your errors are because it's aware of what data is available. It sees the schema. Every time you run the dev server or run a build, it pulls down the entire GraphQL schema and writes those type bindings. There are some really great tasks. So you can run yarn scaffold pages, and it will download every page in your Silverstripe website that you've exposed and create placeholder templates and placeholder queries for them. It'll look at the data and figure out, what kind of data would you be wanting to get off this this data type. Really useful. And likewise, I just want to say one more thing about this. There's also scaffold blocks, which I'm going to show you. Really useful for just generating. You've got like 20 blocks and you want to, write queries and templates for every single one of them. It's really easy to just bring them all down. There's a setup command just to get you started. It'll ask you to get your API key, set the environment variables, etc. Make sure that you have the Nexjs module installed on your Silverstripe website, and a really good way to get started. Preview is built in. When you are editing a page in the CMS, you're looking at the headless instance on the left there. As you type and save, it's going to update the headless instance. You notice that the URL has been rewritten to a token, And that's because we do that with a JWT handshake between the Silverstripe CMS and the Headless instance. Static build configuration. Out of the box, you just get a couple different options. You're kind of encouraged to create more of these, but in this case, the two that come with it are most recently edited pages and pages in a section. And all you have to do is just write a subclass for this static build collector and tell it how to fetch its data. So you might want to create one, for instance, that is featured products, blogs with most commented blogs or something, right? You could even do integrations where you wanted to go out and interrogate the Google Analytics API and find out what are my most visited pages and do that as a static build collector. You get to define how many pages should each one of these collectors get, and then there's the aggregate limit on top that will truncate the entire set to a certain size. So that supersedes everything. If both of those things in that list come back with 100, then you're only getting 100 because the aggregate limit above is set. So really good way, and obviously drag and drop, you can set the priority that each one should take. Really good way to configure that static build. And you can preview the static build as well. There's another tab for that where it'll show you like, oh, you've set it to these two collectors. This is what it's going to get. And what is the next slide? I'm terrified to click on the next slide because, oh God. Okay, yep, it's demo time. All right, here we go. Who likes live demos? Here we go. So I'm going to show you a few things. And I'm going to start. How's the font size? Is the font size good? Good font size? Should I check the chat? How do we get to the chat? Let's see. Someone tell me if the font size is good. Chat. Is it visible? I can't tell. I got a big screen, so. All right, I'm gonna take the silence as that you're complicit with the font size. Yay, Lars came through for me. Okay, here we are. So I've checked out the repository, and someone asked where is it? It's Silverstripe Nexjs starter under the Silverstripe organization. So here I am, and so there's 4 different flavors of the starter. This is called base. And it's just bare bones. It's no theming, and it just renders the navigation by default. There's also base theme, which gives you a bit of a theme, so you have something to look at. And there's also a content blocks flavor of both of those. Content blocks are handled a bit differently. So if you're dealing with Elemental and you don't do page content, you want to use the content blocks branches. We'll do both. So here I am in the base theme, and I'm just going to run yarn setup. And it's going to ask me, have you installed the Nexjs module? And of course I have. And I'm going to point it to stripecon1.test. And then it's going to ask me for the API key, which I'm going to click on this link. And it took me off screen. So, and I can click on the default admin here, API keys, and there it is. So I'll grab that and paste it in. Oh, come on. Oh, that's not right. Okay, and then it tells me I need to set some environment variables. So I'm going to grab this, and this is for that JWT interaction that I spoke about before. So I'll go to this and I'll set my preview key. And this font is probably smaller. I'm not going to be dealing with PHP Storm too much. So if you can't see that, all I'm doing is setting an environment variable called Nexjs preview key in my PHP environment. So I've set all that stuff up, and I'll go back and say, okay, cool, I did it. It's going to give me a few tasks I can run, some ideas on how to get started. I am right now just going to run yarn dev and see where I ended up. So you saw it just download the GraphQL schema there and write the type definition file. I'll open up localhost. It's going to the wrong tab. So right there, you can see I've got just the main navigation and this kind of stuff, okay? So let's have a look at the file structure, and you can see how things are working here. So in my source folder, I've got this templates directory, and all your templates go in here. Any page template needs to be in this templates directory. There's a couple different ways you can arrange this. the way that I've chosen is by naming the directory after the page type name, and then just using the generic names component and query under that. So this page / component.tsx is the page, and query.graphql is the query that will be associated with that. You can also name this page.tsx and page.graphql and not do the whole folder thing. I just kind of refer it this way. So, but that's the convention. So we've got this page here, and one thing we're not seeing is the content, right? We're only seeing the title. So I'm going to just do the HTML element, right? And it brings up Silverstripe Nexjs Toolkit, which is the provider of all the wonderful client-side tools that we're going to use. And I'm going to say read one page. Oh, this is getting annoying. On page.content. And it auto-completes that for me because it knows what the query is. And I can save that and refresh my browser. And so now I'm getting content, right? So that's good. And I'll bring the size up here. Cool. Let's have a quick look at just a couple other things here. And you'll see in main menu a good example of using static query. So that's my main menu. And you can see that I'm just using the use static query hook. I've got my menu items, and then I'm piping that into navigation. So you can, because use static query isn't going to know exactly what kind of data is coming back, you can coerce it with the generic there, where I'm just saying, expect to get back read pages. So that's how use static query works. Really useful. But I think I'm ready to move on to something more interesting to look at. So let's go to this, which is, what's different? Oh, good. So this is my themed version, and I'm just going to run yarn dev on here, and we can see what's going on. Oops. And this is refreshing. And so this is got just a basic theme to it. I can kind of navigate around the drop down here, and cool. Now, one thing we're missing here is that the homepage isn't any different. And if you go to my CMS, I'm going to increase the font size here for you. So this is the homepage, and I've got this hero image, and there's some data in there, and we're not seeing it because we're just refresh that. It's just this generic page. So we need to change that. Let's kill the server, and we're going to run scaffold pages. And hopefully that'll bring down the home page because it knows that it's in the system. I don't have a template for it though. So let's see what happened. I've now got my homepage directory there, and it's built out a component, and it's built out an example query as well. So it's grabbed all that hero stuff for me. And so to customize the homepage, I'm actually just going to get rid of this, and then I'm going to add some of the boilerplate around here to make it look nice. So close the div, close the main, and I'm going to format. And I'll put in here my hero component, which I have saved somewhere. And I think it's right here. Let's get this. And I'll paste this in. There we go. And it's lighting up like a Christmas tree because all kinds of stuff is missing. So I need to extract that from the query result that's coming in as a prop. So I'm going to say hero image, I need, right? Hero link, a hero subheadline, hero headline, I think. And they're all lighting up because this might be null, so I'm just going to assert that it isn't and keep it happy. And now everything is good. Now I've added I've extracted all these variables from the query result, but I haven't actually queried for them. So let's go back to the query, and it's added these things that I don't need. I don't want ID, that's not necessary. But it did guess that I'm going to need hero image at some point, and it just put a placeholder in there. So I'm going to add absolute link for the image and a title for SEO purposes. This hero link is just a typical has one to a site tree. So all I need here is link. That's for the button, right? So I'll save that, and we'll see how we did on the, oh, I'm not running my dev server. Let's see how we did. Cool. So now I have my hero image, right? I'm going to add one more layer of complexity before I leave you. We're going to have a look at content blocks next. So let's go to my next demo here. And just run yarn dev, get the server going. And I'll have a look at the CMS, and you can see what's going on from the back end. So on the home page, I've got my hero image as I did before, but you can see I'm using Elemental now, and I've got some cool like blocks here. I'll click into this, and I've got property defined as a data object, and I'm just associating property 1, 2, and 3 in my featured properties block, right? Now, in order to get access to this data, there's something I do need to do on the Silverstripe side, which I forgot to mention. You need to expose the data objects you want as part of your public API, because the magic of Headless is just that like you can just query the API for anything, right? But to just say every single data object is part of the API is kind of insane, and it's not just a security issue. It's actually like you just end up polluting the API with all kinds of like nonsense, like things you'll never use. So the approach to do it as an allow list instead of a disallow list seemed better. So here, if you can't see that, all it is a bit of YAML config, and it's saying included data objects is app \**. So you can wildcard the namespace. So I'm just saying anything in the app namespace should be exposed to the API. So now that I've done that, that's ensuring that all those content blocks that I've created are actually part of the API. So let's scaffold those pages now. Bring down all the good stuff. And we'll see how we're doing now. So you can see here, it's trying to run to those blocks, but there's no templates for them. So it's just giving you this kind of placeholder thing that says like, I need to go do some work. So let's see how that's going to work. So as I said before, the way that content blocks are queried is kind of complicated, because you have to have an entry for every single block on every single page. So this is where fragments really shine. So in this fragments directory, you'll see elemental, and then each block gets its own fragment. So element content fields, for instance, gets its own fragment, and it's just going to be really simple. All it needs is HTML, because everything else belongs to base element fields, right? So, but more complex blocks are going to have larger selection sets here. But this _elements GraphQL is really where all the magic happens, because this ends up being created with every single block that gets added. And as you add blocks, you don't have to worry about making sure that every single one is selected on every single page. That's just handled for you, as it should be, because this is a robot can do this, right? It's always going to be the same thing. It's always going to be add an inline fragment for this specific block type and add the fragment for its fields, right? So it's a bit of code generation that helps you. So this is the time when we want to run Scaffold Blocks and get all those blocks down so we can work with them. And so it pulled down all the blocks I'm using. And if we go to the browser now, or sorry, the code editor, you can see it generated some stuff. So here I've got my property 1, 2, and 3 that I'm going to need. And it's also going to, I believe, up here in components, it's created the component, which is just going to be, element type name. So when we go to light up the dev server again, we're probably going to see just some really empty looking blocks. So here it's just rendering type name, right? So we need to do something about those templates. So fortunately, I do have a featured properties block already saved that I'm just going to paste in. And let's just delete this whole thing. And we've got a bit of housekeeping to do because you'll see some things are lighting up. So I'm going to make sure that I have link. I think there's also a calendar icon in here that I need. So I'll just do that. Heroicons. I think that's it. Calendar icon. So that's good. So now we've got some data issues. So it's asking for, it wants properties as an array, and I've got, of course, got property 1, 2, 3. So let's take that out. Oops. And notice the prop that's coming here is element, right? That's the block that I'm working with. If you can't see that because it's off the screen. So I'll just say property 1, property 2, property 3. Okay, and then I'll create the array. That's really getting annoying. And of course, these are all nullable, so I'm just going to do this. Okay, so now I've got some properties, and it's working pretty well. Now, the one area that's still lit up is this timestamp thing. It needs timestamp for that date time, and of course, timestamp isn't a property of property. So let's have a look at the GraphQL query that was generated, and so we can start putting in some data. So we go to the featured properties GraphQL file. I'm going to add in everything I need, and I'm going to do this by memory. I think it's ID. ID. Title. I think it's primary image. I need that with an absolute link. The title probably. Bedrooms, bathrooms, available. And for the availability date, I want to format that as nice. So let's do that. I don't think, oh, you know what? I forgot link. I need link. So I can now add all that stuff in. Now, we have that timestamp property, and that's just a bit weird because it's not, we either need to generate that in the component or we can get it as part of the GraphQL request. And what I'm going to do is opt for doing it in GraphQL. And this is just a little GraphQL trick that you might know. You can alias fields. So I'm going to say timestamp is aliased to available format timestamp. Okay, so I'm able to select the same field twice with different variations by using an alias like that. And we don't have the ability to do fragments within fragments, so I guess just have to do a bit of copy and paste. I'll save that. And this is still unhappy because it's saying, oh, but I know that the type is whatever and it doesn't have a timestamp property on it. So I'm just going to do this little hacky thing. Oops, property. So I can get the property type out of the schema, timestamp, string, and then this one I'll just coerce. Whoops. Oops. Cool. And now it should be happy. I think it is. Yep, it's green. Green is good. And if we refresh this, it kind of worked. What did I miss? Oh, is it the screen is too small? Is that it? No. The layout's a bit broken. They're usually side by side, but you can see, I think I missed a div somewhere. Live demo. What could go wrong? So that, I'm going to leave it at that. That's all I have to show for you today. So to get started with the Nexjs starter kit, you can go to Silverstripe. I'll blow this up a bit. Nexjs starter, it's documented. You can get going pretty easily. It should be pretty clear on what you need to do. And I would really invite you to join me in pushing this forward as the next frontier for Silverstripe. It's a great place to start, and it's really, really fun. So I'd like to thank everyone who organized this event. It's awesome. I love doing it. I appreciate being invited to speak, and excited to hear the other talks. So thank you, everyone.
Thank you to you, Aaron. Very, very cool. I'm using Nexjs and Silverstripe for 2 years, I think, but I am doing everything manually. So what you are doing with this project, I'm very bad in product development, and it really looks good. I'm keen to test it and get my Nexjs jobs very much faster done.
Cool. Glad to hear it.
Yes, we have had one important question from Stacy. It's where does your nickname actually come from? We don't know.
It's amazing how many times I've told this story. It's funny. It's a really distinct nickname, so naturally it gets a lot of questions. So in a previous life, before I was doing any kind of web development, I was working at a school and I was aspiring to be a teacher. I worked with a one-on-one with a child who had a whole host of struggles with learning. I think he was like I think he had Asperger's and things like that. Like he was a really interesting kid, and he cracked me up. But I just remember the first day I put on my shirt and tie, and I was just so ready to become Mr. Carlino, the teacher. And I introduced myself to him, and I said, "I'm Mr. Carlino. I'm going to be working with you this year." And I said, "I understand." And his name was Aaron as well. And he just looked up at me, and he said, "Uncle Cheese." And I said, "No, I don't think you understood. Mr. Carlino." And he said, "Uncle Cheese." And I went back and forth with him for like the rest of the day, and I was, it wasn't getting through. And in a intermediate school with kids who are like 11, 12, 13 years old, once they find out that Mr. Carlino is known as Uncle Cheese, like there's no stopping that. It just spread so fast, and I was like, I need to just embrace this. So that's the story. I just ran with it. I said, "Okay, fine, I'm Uncle Cheese."
Nice to hear. I didn't know the story. Thank you for that. We have no time for many questions. Just one question from Herbert. Is it production ready? The product, the Silverstripe module you are using?
No. What is? I mean, look, the thing is, like, we need early adoption. None of this stuff ever gets into production unless someone takes a chance on it and is willing to kind of pitch in and help improve it. So, when everyone is playing defense like that and saying like, "I'm not going to do it until it's tag stable," nothing ever happens. So help us evolve. Get involved. Try it out. It doesn't have to make it all the way to production, but if you can kind of battle test it a bit and see what happens, So
we will be happy. The Silverstripers I know are many things, but not defensive. So I think you will hear feedback soon. So
good.
Thank you very much. The one thing that is missing from this system is applause, but you see in the chats that there's much happening.